The Soul and the Machine, Chapter 6 of Jill Lepore's These Truths. This is meant to be audio support for APUS students. Maria W. Stewart, dark and beautiful, carried a manuscript tucked under her arm as she picked her way through the cobbled streets of Boston to the offices of the Liberator at 11 Merchants Hall down by the docks. Our souls are fired with the same love of liberty and independence with which your souls are fired, she'd written in an essay she hoped to publish. The descendants of slaves, she'd been born free in Connecticut in 1803. Orphaned at 5, she'd been bound as a servant to a clergyman until she turned 15. In August of 1826, weeks after the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, she married a much older man. She was 23, her husband James W. Stewart, described as a tolerably stout, well-built man, a light, bright mulatto. Had served as a sailor during the War of 1812. Captured, he'd been a prisoner of war. "It is the blood of our fathers and the tears of our brethren that have enriched your soils," Maria Stewart wrote in her first revolutionary essay about American history, "and we claim our rights." William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator, was 2 years younger than Stewart. He'd apprenticed as a typesetter and worked as a printer and an editor, and failed again and again, before founding his most radical newspaper. A thin, balding white man, he slept on a bed on the floor in his cramped office, a printing press in the corner. He kept a cat to catch rats. Stewart told Garrison she wished to write for his newspaper, to say what she thought needed saying to the American people. Impressed with her intelligence and excellence of character, he later recalled, he published the first of her essays in 1831 in a column called The Ladies' Department. "This is the land of freedom," Stewart wrote. "Every man has a right to express his opinion. And every woman, too," she asked. "How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles?" Stewart was born-again Christian, caught up in the religious revival that swept the country and reached its height in the 1820s and 1830s in the factory towns that grew like kudzu along the path cut by the Erie Canal from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, where the power of steam and the anxiety of industrialization were answered by the power of Christ and the assurance of the gospel. Before the revival began, a scant 1 in 10 Americans were church members. By the time it ended, that ratio had risen to 8 in 10. The Presbyterian minister Lyman Beecher called it the greatest work of God and the greatest revival of religion that the world has ever seen. Now, a quick pause. A big theme here is that we have a market industrial revolution happening at the same time, and in response to, we have a second great awakening of religion. Back to the reading. The revival, known as the Second Great Awakening, infused American politics with the zealotry of millennialism. Its most ardent converts believed that they were on the verge of eliminating sin from the world, which would make it possible for the second coming of Christ, who was expected to arrive in as short a time as 3 months, and to come, not to the Holy Lands, to Bethlehem or Jerusalem, but to the industrializing United States, to Cincinnati and Chicago, to Detroit and Utica. Its ministers preached the power of the people, offering a kind of spiritual Jacksonianism. "God has made man a moral free agent," said the thundering 6'3" firebrand Charles Grandison Finney, and the revival was revolutionary. By emphasizing spiritual equality, it strengthened protest against slavery and against the political inequality of women. "It is not the color of the skin that makes the man or the woman," wrote Stewart, "but the principle formed in the soul." The democratization of American politics was hastened by revivalists like Stewart, who believed in the salvation of the individual through good works and in the equality of all people in the eyes of God. Against that belief stood the stark and brutal realities of an industrializing age, the grinding of souls. So we have the Second Great Awakening, largely run by women in many cases, but not all women, and it strengthened protests against slavery and even against the equality of women. So if we're beginning to have a women's rights movement and anti-slavery movement coming out of a Second Great Awakening, which believed, unlike the first one, that we can improve ourselves and improve mankind. Part 1. The United States was born as a republic and grew into a democracy, and as it did, it split in two, unable to reconcile its system of government with the institution of slavery. In the first decade of the 19th century, democracy came to be celebrated. The right of a majority to govern became dogmatic, and the right to vote was extended to all white men, developments much derided by conservatives who warned that the rule of numbers would destroy the republic. By the 1830s, the American experiment had produced its first large-scale popular democracy in the history of the world, a politics expressed in campaigns and parades, rallies and conventions. with a two-party system run by partisan newspapers and an electorate educated in a new system of publicly funded schools. The great debates of the middle decades of the 19th century had to do with the soul and the machine. One debate merged religion and politics. What were the political consequences of the idea of the equality of souls? Could the soul of America be redeemed from the nation's original sin, the constitutional sanctioning of slavery? Another debate merged politics and technology. Could the nation's new democratic traditions survive in the age of the factory, the railroad, and the telegraph? If all events in time can be explained by earlier events in time, if history is a line and not a circle, then the course of events, change over time, is governed by a set of laws, like the laws of physics, and driven by a force, like gravity. What is that force? Is it driven by God, by people, by machines? Is progress the progress of Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan's 1678 allegory, the journey of a Christian from sin to salvation? Is progress the extension of suffrage, voting rights, the spread of democracy? Or is it a progress invention, the invention of new machines? What is progress? A distinctly American idea of progress involved geography as destiny, picturing improvement as change not over time, but also over space. In 1824, Jefferson wrote that a traveler crossing the continent from west to east would be conducting a survey in time of the progress of man from the infancy of creation to the present day, since in his progress he would meet the gradual shades of improving man. His traveler, a surveyor at once of time and space, would begin with the savages of the Rocky Mountains. These he would observe in the earliest stage of association, living under no law but that of nature, subscribing and converting themselves with flesh and skins of wild beasts. Moving eastward, Jefferson's imaginary traveler would then stop on our frontiers, where he'd find savages in a pastoral state, raising domestic animals to supply the defects of hunting. Next, and farther east, he'd meet our own semi-barbarous citizens, the pioneers of the advance of civilization. Finally, he'd reach the seaport towns of the Atlantic, finding man in as yet most improved state. Maria Stewart's Christianity stipulated the spiritual equality of all souls, but Jefferson's notion of progress was hierarchical. That hierarchy, in Jackson's era, was the logic behind African colonization, and it was also the logic behind a federal government policy known as Indian removal. Native peoples living east of the Mississippi were required to settle in the lands to the west, a picture of progress as the stages from barbarism to civilization, stages that could be traced on a map of the American continent, competed with the picture of progress as an unending change of machines. The age of the machine had begun in 1769 in Glasgow, when James Watt patented an improvement of the steam engine. People had tapped into natural sources of power for manufacturing before with water wheels and windmills, but Watt's models produced 5 times the power of a water wheel and didn't need to be sited on a river. A steam engine could work anywhere. Watt reckoned the power of a horse at 10 times the power of a man. He defined 1 horsepower as the energy required to lift 550 pounds by 1 foot in 1 second. Powered by steam, manufacturing became, in the 19th century, 200 times more efficient than it had been in the 18th century. That this invention would eventually upend political arrangements is prefigured in the likely apocryphal story told at the time about Watt and the King of England. When King George III went into a factory to see Watt's engine at work, he was told that the factory was manufacturing an article of which kings were fond. "What article is that?" he asked. The reply? Power. There followed a machine upon machine, steam-driven looms, steam-driven boats, making for faster production, faster travel, and cheaper goods. Steam-powered industrial production altered the economy, and it also altered social relations, especially between men and women, and between the rich and the poor. The anxiety and the social dislocation produced by these changes fueled the revival of religion. Everywhere, the flame of revival burned brightest in factory towns. Before the rise of the factory, home and work weren't separate places. Most people lived on farms, where both men and women worked in the fields. In the winter, women spent most of their time carding, spinning, and weaving wool, shearing from sheep. In towns and cities, shopkeepers and the masters of artisanal trades, bakers, tailors, printers, shoemakers, lived in their shops, where they also usually made their goods. They shared this living space with journeymen and apprentices. Artisans made things whole, undertaking each step in the process of manufacturing. A baker baked a loaf, a tailor stitched a suit. With the rise of the factory came the division of labor into steps done by different workers. With steam power, not only were the steps in the manufacturing process divided, but much of that labor was done by machines, which came to be known as mechanical slaves. New steam-powered machines could also spin and even weave in ornate multicolor patterns. In 1802, Joseph-Marie Jacquard, a French weaver, invented an automated loom. By feeding into his loom stiff paper cards with holes punched in them, he could instruct it to weave any pattern he liked. 2 decades later, the English mathematician Charles Babbage used Jacquard's method to devise a machine that could compute. That is, it could make mathematical calculations. He called it the difference engine, a giant mechanical hand-cranked calculating machine that could tabulate any polynomial function. Then he invented another machine. He called it the analytical engine that could apply the act of mechanical tabulation to solve any problem that involved logic. Babbage never built a working machine, but Ada Lovelace, a mathematician and daughter of Lord Byron, later prepared a detailed description and analysis of the principles and promises of Babbage's work, the first account of what would become in the 20th century a general-purpose computer. In the United States, with its democracy of numbers, a calculating computer, a machine that could count, would one day throw a wrench in the machinery of government. But long before that day came, Americans devised simpler machines. Watt jealously guarded his patents. In 1810, an American merchant named Francis Cabot Lowell toured England's textile mills and made sketches from memory. In New England, working from those sketches, he designed his own machines and began raising money to build his own factory. Lowell died in 1817. His successors opened the Lowell Mills on the Merrimack River in 1823. Every step from carding to cloth was done in the same set of factories, 6 brick buildings erected around a central clock tower. Inspired by the social reformer Robert Owen, Lowell meant his system as a model, an alternative to the harsh conditions found in factories in England. He called it the Philanthropic Manufacturing College. The Lowell mill owners hired young women, transplants from New England farm towns. They worked 12 hours a day and attended lectures in the evening. They published a monthly magazine. But the utopia that Francis Cabot Lowell imagined did not last. By the 1830s, mill owners had cut wages and sped up the pace of work, and when women protested, they were replaced by men. Factories accelerated productions, canals accelerated transportation. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, took 8 years to dig and covered 360 miles. Before the canal, the wagon trip from Buffalo to New York City took 20 days. On the canal, it took 6. The price of goods plummeted. The standard of living soared. A mattress that cost $50 in 1815, which meant that almost no one owned one, cost only $5 in 1848. One stop on the Erie Canal was Rochester, a mill town on the shore of Lake Ontario that processed the grain from the surrounding farms. In 1818, Rochester exported 260,000 barrels of flour a year. Its mills were small, made up of 12 to 15 men working alongside a master in a single room, in the master's house. There was, as there had been in such shops for centuries, a great deal of drinking. Workers were often paid not in wages but in liquor. Work wasn't done by the clock but by the task. By the end of the 1820s, after the completion of the canal, these small shops had become bigger shops, typically divided into 2 rooms and employing many more men, each doing a smaller portion of the work and generally working by the clock for wages. Work came to mean not simply labor, but a place, the factory or the banker's or the clerk's office, a place men went every day for 10 to 12 hours. Home was where women remained, and where what they did all day was no longer considered work. That is, they were not paid. The lives of women and men diverged. Wage workers became less and less skilled. Owners made more and more money. Rochester was exporting 200,000 barrels of flour a year by 1828, and by the end of the 30s, 500,000. In 1829, a newspaper editor who used the word boss had to define it, a foreman or master workman of modern coinage. By the 1830s, only the boss still worked in the shop. His employees worked in factories. Masters or bosses no longer lived in shops or even in the neighborhoods of factories. They moved to new neighborhoods, enclaves of a new middle class. That new middle class soon grew concerned about the unruliness of workers, and especially about their drinking. Inspired by a temperance crusade led by the revivalist Lyman Beecher, a group of mill owners formed the Rochester Society for the Promotion of Temperance. That's like not drinking as much. Its members pledged to give up all liquor and to stop paying their workers in alcohol. Swept up in the spirit of evangelical revival, they began to insist that their workers join their churches, and they ultimately fired those who did not. In this effort, they were led principally by their wives. Women led the temperance movement, spurred to this particular crusade, not least because drunken husbands tended to beat their wives. Few laws protected women from such assaults. Husbands addicted to drinking also spent their wages on liquor, leaving their children hungry. Since married women had no right to own property, they had no recourse under the law. Convincing men to give up alcohol seemed the best solution, but the movement was also a consequence of deeper and broader changes. When the separation of home from work, there emerged an ideology of separate spheres. The public world of work and the politics was the world of men. The private world of home and family was the world of women. Women, within this understanding, were the gentler sex, more nurturing, more loving, and more moral. One advice manual, A Voice to the Married, told wives that they should make the home a haven for their husbands, an Elysium to which he can flee and find rest from the story strife of the selfish world. These changes in the family had begun before industrialization, but industrial sped them up. Middle-class and wealthier women began having fewer children, an average of 3.6 children per woman in the 1830s, compared to 5.8 a generation earlier. No new method of contraception made this possible. Declining fertility was the consequence of abstinence. Lyman Beecher wielded enormous influence in this era of reform, and so did his indomitable daughter, Catherine, who advocated for the education of girls and published a treatise on domestic economy, advice for housewives. But the most powerful preacher to this new middle class, and especially to its women, was Charles Grandison Finney. Finney had been born again in 1821, when he was 29, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him, as he put it, like a wave of electricity. He was ordained 3 years later by a female missionary society. He held big meetings and small tent meetings and prayer groups. He looked his listeners in the eye. A revival is not a miracle, he said. We are either marching towards heaven or towards hell. How is it with you? Women didn't always constitute the majority of converts, but their influence was felt on many who did convert. Another female missionary society invited Finney to Rochester in 1830, where he preached every night and 3 times on Sunday for 6 months. He preached to all classes, all sexes, and all ages, but above all to women. Church membership doubled during Finney's 6-month stay in Rochester, driven by women. The vast majority of new joiners, more than 70%, followed the faith of their mothers, but not of their fathers. One man complained after Finney visited, "He stuffed my wife with tracts and alarmed her fears, and nothing short of meetings day and night could atone for the many-fold sins my poor simple spouse had committed. And at the same time she made the miraculous discovery that she had been unevenly yoked." By exercising their power as moral reformers, the wives, daughters of factory owners brought their men into churches. Factory owners began posting job signs that read, "None but the temperate need apply." They even paid their workers to go to church. The revival was, for many Americans, heartfelt and abiding, but for many others it was not. As one Rochester mill worker said, "I don't give a damn. I get $5 more in a month than I got before I got religion." If the sincerity of converts was often dubious, another kind of faith was taking deeper root in the 1820s, an evangelical faith in technological progress, an unquestioned conviction that a new machine was making the world better. The faith had a special place in the United States, as if machines had a distinctive destiny on the American continent. In prints and paintings, progress appeared as a steam-powered locomotive, chugging across the continent, unstoppable. Writers celebrated inventors as men of progress, conquerors of nature, and lauded their machines as far worthier than poetry. The triumph of the sciences over the arts meant the defeat of the ancients by the moderns. The genius of Eli Whitney, hero of modernity, was said to rival that of Shakespeare. The head of the U.S. Patent Office declared the Steamboat a mightier epic than the Iliad. So we have these dual things happening, a religious revival and belief in the betterment of man through religion and the betterment of man through industrialization and machines at the same time. And many historians argue that the uneasiness caused by machines and industrialization fueled this religious revival. In 1829, Jacob Bigelow, the Rumford Professor of Physical and Mathematical Sciences at Harvard, delivered a series of lectures called The Elements of Technology. Before Bigelow, technology had meant the arts, mostly the mechanical arts. Bigelow used the word to mean the application of science for the benefit of society. For him, the march of improvement amounted to a kind of mechanical millennialism. Next to the influence of Christianity on our moral nature, he later proclaimed, technology has had a leading sway in promoting the progress and happiness of our race. His critics charged him with preaching the gospel of machinery. The Welshman Thomas Carlyle, calling the era the age of machinery, complained that the faith in machines had grown into a religious delusion, as wrong and as dangerous as the belief in witchcraft. Carlyle argued that people like Bigelow, who believed that machines liberate mankind, made a grave error. Machines are prisons. Free in hand and foot, we are shackled in heart and soul with a far straighter than feudal chains. Carlyle insisted, fettered by chains of our own forging. American writers refuting Carlyle argued that the age of machinery was itself making possible the rise of democracy. In 1831, an Ohio lawyer named Timothy Walker, replying to Carlyle, claimed that by liberating the ordinary men from the drudgery that would otherwise prohibit his full political participation, machines drive democracy. Opponents of Andrew Jackson had considered his presidency not progress but decay. The republic has degenerated into a democracy, one Richmond newspaper declared in 1834. To Jackson's supporters, his election marked not a degeneration, but a new stage in the history of progress. Nowhere was this argument made more forcefully or more influentially than in George Bancroft's History of the United States from the Discovery of the American Continent to the Present. The book itself, reviewers noted, voted for Jackson. The spread of evangelical Christianity, the invention of new machines, and the rise of American democracy convinced Bancroft that humanism is steady advancing, and that the advance of liberty and justice is certain. That advance, men like Bancroft and Jackson believed, required Americans to march across the continent, carry these improvements from east to the west, the way Jefferson had pictured it. Democracy, John O'Sullivan, a New York lawyer and Democratic editor, argued in 1839, is nothing more than Christianity in its earthly aspect. O'Sullivan would later coin the term manifest destiny to describe this set of beliefs, the idea that the people of the United States were fated to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given them for the development of the great experiment of liberty. To evangelical Democrats, democracy, Christianity, and technology were levers of the same machine, and yet all along there were critics, dissenters, and objectors who saw in the soul of the people, in the march of progress, in the unending chain of machines, in the seeming forward movement of history, little but violence and backwardness, and the great crushing of men, women, and children. "O America, America," Maria Stewart cried, "foul and indelible is thy stain." Stewart had studied the Bible from childhood, a study she kept up her whole life, even as she scrubbed other people's houses and washed other people's clothes. "While my hands are toiling for their daily sustenance," she wrote, "my heart is most generally meditating upon its divine truths." She considered slavery a sin. She took her inspiration from the Scripture. "I have borrowed much from my language from the Holy Bible," she said, but she also borrowed much of her language, especially the language of rights, from the Declaration of Independence. That the revival of Christianity coincided with the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, an anniversary made all the more mystical when the news spread that both Jefferson and Adams had died that very day, July 4th, 1826, as if by the hand of God, meant that the Declaration itself took on religious cast. The self-evident secular truths of the Declaration of Independence became, to evangelical Americans, the truth of a revealed religion. To say that this marked a turn away from the spirit of the nation's founding is to wildly understate the case. The United States was founded during the most secular era in American history. That means non-religious, either before or since. In the late 18th century, church membership was low, and an anti-clerical feeling was high. It is no accident that the Constitution does not mention God. Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush wondered politely whether this error might be corrected, assuming it to have been an oversight. Perhaps an acknowledgement might be of his goodness or of his providence in the proposed amendments, he urged. No correction was made. The United States was not founded as a Christian nation. The Constitution prohibits religious tests for office holders. The Bill of Rights forbids the federal government from establishing religion. James Madison having argued that to establish a religion would be to foster in those who still reject it a suspicion that its friends are too conscious of its fallacies to trust to its own merits. These were neither casual omissions nor accidents. They represented an intentional disavowal of a constitutional relationship between church and state, a disavowal that was not infrequently specifically stated. In 1797, John Adams signed the Treaty of Tripoli, securing the release of American captives in North Africa, and promising that the United States would not engage in a holy war with Islam because the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on Christian religion. But during the Second Great Awakening, evangelicals recast the nation's origins as avowedly Christian. Upon what was the America founded? Maria Stewart asked, and answered, upon religion and pure principles. Lyman Beecher argued that the Republic, in its Constitution and its laws, is of heavenly origin. Nearly everything took on a religious cast during the revival, not the least because of the proliferation of preachers. In 1775, there had been 1,800 ministers in the United States. By 1845, there were more than 40,000. They were Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Congregationalists, Episcopalian, Universalist, and more, very much the flowering of religious expression that Madison had predicted would result from the prohibition of an established religion. The separation of church and state allowed religion to thrive. That was one of its intentions. Lacking an established state religion, Americans founded new sects, from Shakers to Mormons, and rival Protestant denominations sprung up in town after town. Increasingly, the only unifying national religion was a civil religion, a belief in the American creed. This faith bound the nation together and provided extraordinary political stability in an era of astonishing change, but it also tied it to the past in ways that often proved crippling. In 1816, when Jefferson was 73 and the awakening was just beginning, he warned against worshiping the men of his generation. This they would say themselves, were they to rise from the dead, he wrote. Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. To treat the founding documents as scripture would to become a slave to the past. Some men look at the constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched, Jefferson conceded. But when they do, they ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human. Abolitionists adopted a different posture. They didn't worship the founders. They judged them. In the spring of 1829, William Lloyd Garrison, who entered the evangelical movement as an advocate of temperance and had only lately begun to concern himself with the problem of slavery, was asked to deliver a 4th of July address before a Massachusetts branch of the Colonization Society at Park Street Church in Boston. He declared that the holiday was filled with hypocritical cant about the inalienable rights of man. This complicated position, a sense of the divinity of the Declaration of Independence mixed with fury at the founders themselves, came above all from black churches, like the church where Maria Stewart and her husband were married, at the African Meeting House on Belknap Street in Boston's free black neighborhood, on the slope of Beacon Hill, known as Hill. Their friend David Walker, a freeborn man from North Carolina, lived not far from the meeting house and kept a slop shop on Battle Street, selling gear to seamen. He likely traded with James W. Stewart, who earned his living outfitting ships. Walker was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. His father was a slave, his mother a free black woman. Sometime between 1810 and 1820, he moved from Wilmington to Charleston, South Carolina, probably drawn to its free black community and to its church. At the very beginning of the revival, the Second Great Awakening, in 1816, the African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded in Philadelphia. Charleston opened an AME church in 1817, and Walker joined. While men like Finney preached to the workers and bosses of Rochester, New York, black evangelicals preached to free blacks who were keenly aware of the very different effects of the age of the machine had on the lives of slaves and slaves' families. Cotton production in the South doubled between 1815 and 1820, and again between 1820 and 1825. Cotton had become the most valuable commodity in the Atlantic world. The Atlantic slave trade had been closed in 1808. But the new and vast global market for cotton created a booming domestic market for slaves. By 1820, more than 1 million slaves had been sold down the river, from states like Virginia and to South Carolina to the territories of Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Another 1 million people were sold and shipped west between 1820 and 1860. Mothers were separated from their children, husbands from wives. When the price of cotton in Liverpool went up, so did the price of slaves in the American South. People like cotton were sold by grades, advertised as extra men, number 1 men, second-rate or ordinary men, extra girls, number 1 girls, second-rate or ordinary girls. Slavery wasn't an aberration in an industrial economy. Slavery was its engine. Factories had mechanical slaves, plantations had human slaves. The power of machines was measured by horsepower, the power of slaves by hand power. A healthy man counted as 2 hands, a nursing woman as a half hand, a child as a quarter hand. Charles Ball, born in Maryland during the American Revolution, spent years toiling on slave plantations in South Carolina, and time on an auction block where buyers inspected his hands, moving each finger in the minute action required to pick cotton. The standard calculation for a cotton crop, 10 acres to the hand. David Walker, living in Charleston, bore witness to those sufferings, and he prayed. So did Denmark Vesey, a carpenter who worshipped with Walker at the same AME church. In 1822, Vesey staged a rebellion, leading a group of slaves and free blacks in a plan to seize the city. Instead, Vesey was caught and hanged. Slave owners blamed black sailors who, they feared, spread the word in the South of freedom in the North and of independence in Haiti. After Vesey's execution, South Carolina's legislature passed the Negro Seaman Act, requiring black sailors to be held in prison while their ships were in port. Walker decided to leave South Carolina for Massachusetts, where he opened a shop for black sailors and helped found the Massachusetts General Colored Association, the first free black political organization in the United States. Meanwhile, he helped runaways. His hands were always open to contribute to the wants of the fugitives, the preacher Henry Highland Garnet later wrote, and he studied He spent all his leisure moments in the cultivation of his mind. He also began helping to circulate in Boston the first black newspaper, Freedmen's Journal, published in New York beginning in 1827. We wish to plead our own cause, its editors proclaimed. Too long have others spoken for us. In the fall of 1829, the year Jacob Bigelow and Thomas Carlyle were arguing about the consequences of technological change, David Walker published a short pamphlet that struck the country like a bolt of lightning. An appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. Combing the exhortations of a revivalist preacher with the rabble-rousing of a Jacksonian political candidate, Walker preached that without saving redemption of abolition, there would come a political apocalypse, the wages of the sin of slavery. I called men to witness that the destruction of the Americans is at hand, and it will be speedily consumed unless they repent. Walker claimed that the Declaration of Independence for all black Americans. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He insisted on the right to revolution. Addressing his white readers, he wrote, "Now, Americans, I ask you candidly, was your sufferings under Great Britain 1/100th part as cruel and tyrannical as you have rendered under ours, under you?" He described American expansion, the growth of the Union from 13 states to 24, as a form of violence. The whites are dragging us around in chains and in handcuffs to their new states and territories, to work their mines and farms, to enrich them and their children. And he damned Manifest Destiny as a fraud, resting on the belief of millions of Americans that we, being a little darker than they, were made by our Creator to be an inheritance to them and to their children forever. He called the scheme of Henry Clay's American Colonization Society the colonizing trick. This country is as much ours as it is the whites. Whether they will admit it or now or not, they will see and believe it by and by. And he warned, are Mr. Clay and the rest of the Americans innocent of the blood and groans of our fathers and us, their children? Every individual may plead innocence if he pleases, but God will, before long, separate the innocent from the guilty. He asked black men to take up arms. Look upon your mother, wife, and children, he urged, and answer God Almighty, and believe this, that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to drink a water when thirsty. And remarking on the history of the West Indies, he warned the owners of men, read the history, particularly of Haiti, and see how they were butchered by the whites, and do you take warning. In an age of quantification, Walker made his own set of calculations. God has been pleased to give us 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 feet, and some sense in our heads as well as they. They have no more right to hold us in slavery than we have to hold them. And then, I do declare it, that 1 good black man can put to death 6 white men. The preaching of David Walker, even more than the preaching of Lyman Beecher or Charles Grandison Finney, set the nation on fire. It was prosecutorial. It was incendiary. It was also widely read. Walker had made elaborate plans to get his appeal into the hands of Southern slaves, with the help of his friends Maria and James Stewart. He stitched copies into the linings of clothes he and Stewart sold the sailors bound for Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah and Wilmington. The appeal went through 3 editions in 9 months. The last edition appeared in June 1830. That August, Walker was found dead in the doorway of his Boston shop. There were rumors he'd been murdered. Rewards of up to $10,000 had been offered for him in the South. More likely, he died of tuberculosis. James and Maria Stewart moved into his old rooms on Belknap Street. Walker had died, but he had spread his word. In 1830, a group of slaves plotting a rebellion were found with a copy of the appeal. With Walker, the anti-slavery argument for gradual emancipation with compensation for slave owners became untenable. Abolitionists began arguing for immediate emancipation, and the Southern anti-slavery societies shut their doors. As late as 1827, the number of anti-slavery groups in the South had outnumbered those in the North by 4 to 1. Southern anti-slavery activists were usually supporters of colonization, not of emancipation. Walker's appeal ended the anti-slavery movement in the South and radicalized it in the North. Garrison published the first issue of the Liberator on January 1st, 1831. It begins with words of uncompromising as Walker's. This is Garrison. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. That summer, in Virginia, a 33-year-old revivalist preacher named Nat Turner planned a slave rebellion for the 4th of July. Turner's rebellion was at once an act of emancipation and of evangelicalism. Both of his parents were slaves. His mother had been born in Africa. His father escaped to the north. The wife of Turner's owner had taught him to read when he was a child. He studied the Bible. He worked in the fields, and he also preached. In 1828, he had a religious vision. He believed God had called him to lead an uprising. White spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, he later said, and blood flowed in streams. He delayed until August when, after killing dozens of whites, he and his followers were caught. Turner was hanged. The rebellion rippled across the Union. The Virginia legislature debated the possibility of emancipating its slaves, fearing that a Nat Turner might be in every family. Quakers submitted a petition to the state legislature calling for abolition. The petition was referred to a committee headed by Thomas Jefferson's 39-year-old grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who proposed a scheme of gradual emancipation. Instead, the legislature passed new laws banning the teaching of slaves to read and write, and prohibiting, too, teaching slaves about the Bible. In a nation founded on a written declaration made sacred by evangelicals during a religious revival, reading about equality became a crime. Alexis de Tocqueville, the sharp-eyed French political theorist and historian, landed in New York in May 1831 for a 9-month tour of the United States. Nat Turner waged his rebellion in Virginia that August. Maria Stewart's first essay appeared in the Liberator that October. If ever America undergoes great revolutions, they will be brought about by the presence of the black race on the soil of the United States, Tocqueville predicted. They will owe their origin not to the equality, but to the inequality of condition. Even as Tocqueville was writing, those revolutions were already being waged. 1831, folks, huge year in the slavery abolition debate. The South doubled down in defending slavery, and the North becomes more radicalized against it. 2. Maria Stewart was the first woman in the United States to deliver an address before a mixed audience, an audience of both women and men, which happened to have been, as well, an audience of both blacks and whites. She spoke suitably in a hall named after Benjamin Franklin. She said she'd heard a voice asking the question, "Who shall go forward and take the reproach that is cast upon the people of color? Shall it be a woman?" And my heart made this reply, "If it is thy will, be it even so, Lord Jesus." Stewart delivered 5 public addresses about slavery between 1831 and 1833, the year Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, in language that echoed hers. At the Society's first convention, Garrison declared, "We plant ourselves upon the declaration of our independence and the truths of divine revelation as upon the everlasting rock." Shall it be a woman? One consequence of the rise of Jacksonian democracy and the Second Great Awakening was the participation of women in the reformation of American politics by way of the American morals. When suffrage was stripped away of all property qualifications, women's lack of political power became starkly obvious. For women who wished to exercise power, the only source of power seemingly left to them was their role as mothers, which they suggested rendered them morally superior to men, more loving, more caring, and more responsive to the cries of the weak. Purporting to act less as citizens than as mothers, cultivating the notion of Republican motherhood, women formed temperance societies, charitable aid societies, peace societies, vegetarian societies, abolition societies. The first female anti-slavery society was founded in Boston in 1833. By 1837, 139 female anti-slavery societies had been founded across the country, including more than 40 in Massachusetts and 30 in Ohio. By then, Maria Stewart had stopped delivering speeches, an act that many women, both black and white, considered too radical for the narrow ambitions of Republican motherhood. After 1835, she never spoke again in public. As Catherine Beecher argued in 1837 in an essay on slavery and abolitionism, with reference to the duty of American females, if the female advocate chooses to come upon a stage and expose her person, dress, and elocution to the public criticism, it is a right to express disgust. While women labored to reform society behind the scenes, men protested in the streets. The 18-teens marked the beginning of a decades-long struggle between labor and business. During the Panic of 1819, as you guys all know about, the first bust in the industrialized 19th century, factories had closed when the banks failed. In New York, a working man's wages fell 75 cents to 12 cents a day. Those who suffered the most were men too poor to vote. It was, in many ways, the suffering of working men during the Panic of 1819 that had led so many men to fight for the right to vote, so that they could have a hand in the direction of affairs. Having secured the franchise, they attacked the banks and all manner of monopolies. In 1828, laborers in Philadelphia formed the Working Men's Party. One writer in 1830 argued that commercial banking was the foundation of artificial inequality of wealth and thereby of artificial inequality of power. Working men demanded shorter hours, 10 instead of 11 or 12, and better conditions. They argued, too, against an unequal and very excessive accumulation of wealth and power into the hands of a few. Jacksonian democracy distributed political power to the many, but industrialization consolidated power in the hands of a few. In Boston, the top 1% of the population controlled 10% of the wealth in 1689, 16% in 1771, and 33% in 1833, and 37% in 1848, while the lowest 80% of the population controlled 39% of the wealth in 1689, 29% in 1771, 14% in 1833, and a mere 4% in 1848. Much the same pattern obtained elsewhere. In New York, the top 1% of the population controlled 40% of the wealth in 1828 and 50% in 1845. The top 4% of the population controlled 63% of the wealth in 1828 and 80% in 1845. I want to repeat that real quickly. Go back up to that line. Jacksonian democracy distributed political power to the many, but industrialization, happening at the same time, consolidated money and economic power in the hands of a few. On to 208. Native-born working men had to contend with the ease with which factory owners could replace them with immigrants who were arriving in unprecedented numbers, fleeing hunger and revolution in Europe and seeking democracy and opportunity in the United States. Many parts of the country, including Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, recruited immigrants by advertising in European newspapers. Immigrants encouraged more immigrants in the letters they wrote home to family and friends, urging them to pack their bags. "This is a free country," a Swedish immigrant wrote home from Illinois in 1850, "and nobody needs to hold his hat in hand for anyone else." A Norwegian wrote from Minnesota, "The principle of equality has been universally accepted and adopted." In 1831, 20,000 Europeans migrated to the United States. In 1854, that number had risen to more than 400,000, while 2.5 million Europeans had migrated to all of the Americas. Between 1500 and 1800, that same number, 2.5 million, arrived specifically in the U.S. between 1845 and 1854 alone. As a proportion of the U.S. population, European immigrants grew from 1.6% in the 1820s to 11.2% in 1860. Writing in 1837, one Michigan reformer called the nation's rate of immigration the boldest experiment upon the stability of government ever made in the annals of time. The largest number of these immigrants were Irish and German. Critics of Jackson, himself the son of Irish immigrants, had blamed his election on the rising population of the poor, newly enfranchised Irishmen. "Everything in the shape of an Irishman was drummed to the polls," one newspaper editor wrote in 1828. By 1860, more than 1 in 8 Americans were born in Europe, including 1.6 million Irish and 1.2 million Germans, the majority of whom were Catholic. As the flood of immigrants swelled, the force of nativism gained strength, as did hostility towards Catholics, fueled by the animus of evangelical Protestants. In 1834, Lyman Beecher delivered a series of anti-Catholic lectures. That same year, Samuel F.B. Morse, a young man of many talents, best known as a painter, published a virulent treatise called Eminent Dangers to the Free Institutions of the United States Through Foreign Immigration, urging the passage of a new immigration law banning all foreign-born Americans from voting. Morse then ran for mayor of New York and lost. Meanwhile, he began devising a secret code of dots and dashes to be used on the telegraph machine he was designing. He believed there existed a Catholic plot to take over the United States. He believed that to defeat such a plot, the U.S. government needed a secret cipher. Eventually, he decided that a better use of his code, not secret but public, would be used to communicate by a network of wires that he imagined would one day stretch across the entire continent. It wouldn't be long, he predicted in 1838, before the whole surface of this country would be channeled for those nerves which are to diffuse with the speed of thought, a knowledge of all that is occurring throughout the land, making, in fact, one neighborhood into the whole country. Could a mere machine quiet the political tumult? In Philadelphia in 1844, riots between Catholics and Protestants left 20 Americans dead. The single biggest wave of immigration in the period came between 1845 and 1849, when Ireland endured a potato famine. 1 million people died and 1.5 million left, most for the United States, where they had landed in the eastern seaboard cities and settled there, having no money to pay for their way to travel inland. Patrick Kennedy, the great-grandfather of the first Catholic to be elected president of the United States, left Ireland in 1849. They lived in an all-Irish neighborhoods, generally in tenements, and worked for abysmal wages. New York lawyer George Templeton Strong, writing in his diary, lamented their foreignness. "Our Celtic fellow citizens are almost as remote from us in temperament and constitution as the Chinese." The Irish, keen to preserve their religion and their communities, built Catholic churches and parochial schools and mutual aid societies. They also turned to the Democratic Party to defend these institutions. By 1850, 1 in every 4 people in Boston was Irish. Signs at shops began to read, "No Irish need apply." Germans who came to the United States in greater numbers than the Irish suffered considerably less prejudice. They usually arrived less destitute and could afford to move inland and become farmers. They tended to settle in the Mississippi or Ohio valleys, where they bought land from earlier German settlers and sent their children to German schools and to German churches. The insularity of both Irish and German communities contributed to a growing movement to establish tax-supported public elementary schools, known as common schools, meant to provide a common academic and civic education to all classes of Americans. Like the extensions of suffrage to all white men, the element of the American experiment propelled the United States ahead of European nations. Much of the movement's strength came from the fervor of revivalists. They hoped that these new schools would assimilate a diverse population of native-born and foreign-born citizens by introducing them to the traditions of American culture and government, so that boys, once men, would vote wisely, and girls, once women, would raise virtuous children. "It is our duty to make men moral," read one popular teacher's manual, published in 1830. Other advocates hoped that a shared education would diminish partisanship. Whatever the motives of its advocates, the common school movement emerged out of and nurtured this strong civic culture. Yet for all the abiding democratic idealism of the common school movement, it was animated as well by nativism. One New York State Assemblyman warned, "We must decompose and cleanse the impurities which rush into our midst. There is but one rectifying agent, one infallible filter, the school." And critics suggested that common schools, vaunted as moral education, provided instead instruction in regimentation. Common schools emphasized industry, working by the clock. This curriculum led working men to voice doubts about the purpose of a such education, with Mechanics Magazine asking in 1834, "What is the education of a common school? Is there a syllable of science taught in one, beyond the rudiments of mathematics? No." Some people have criticized the MCAS regimen as sort of a similar bend. Black children were excluded from common schools, leading one Philadelphia woman to point out the hypocrisy of defenders of slavery who based their argument on the ignorance of Americans of African descent. Conscious of the unequal advantages enjoyed by our children, we feel indignant against those who are continually vituperating us from the ignorance and degradation of our people. Free black families supported their own schools, like the African Free School in New York, which by the 1820s had more than 600 students. In other cities, black families fought for integration of common schools and won. In 1855, the Massachusetts legislature, urged on by Charles Sumner, made integration mandatory. This occasioned an outcry. The New York Herald warned, "The North is to be Africanized. Amalgamation has commenced. New England heads the column. God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts." No other state followed. Instead, many specifically passed laws making integration illegal. With free schools, literacy spread and the number of newspapers rose, a change that was tied to the rise of a new party system. Parties come and go, but a party system, a pair of stable parties, has characterized American politics since the ratification debates. In American history, the change from one party system to another has nearly always been associated with a revolution in communications that allows people to shake loose the controls of parties. In the 1790s, during the rise of the first party system, which pitted Federalists against Republicans, the number of newspapers had swelled. During the shift from the second party system, which beginning in 1833 pitted Democrats against the newly founded Whig Party, not only did the number of newspapers rise, but their prices plummeted. The newspapers of the first party system, which were also known as commercial advertisers, had consisted chiefly of partisan commentary and ads, and generally sold for 6 cents an issue. The new papers cost only 1 cent and were far more widely read. The rise of the so-called penny press also marked the beginning of the triumph of facts over opinion in American journalism, mainly because the penny press aimed at a different, broader, and less exclusively partisan audience. The New York Sun appeared in 1833. "It shines for all" was its common man motto. The object of this paper is to lay before the public, at a price within the means of everyone, all the news of the day, it boasted. It dispensed with subscriptions and instead was circulating at newsstands, where it was sold for cash to anyone who had a red penny. Its front page was filled not with advertising but with news. The penny press was a free press, as James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald put it, because it wasn't beholden to parties. Bennett, born in Scotland, had immigrated to the United States after reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Since the paper was sold at newsstands rather than mailed to subscribers, he explained, its editors and writers weren't entirely ignorant who its readers are and who are not. They couldn't favor their readers' politics because they didn't know them. "We shall support no party," Bennett insisted. "We shall endeavor to record facts." During the days of the penny press, Tocqueville observed that Americans had decided preference for weighing the facts of a matter themselves. He said, "They mistrust systems. They adhere closely to facts and study facts within their own senses, as they do not easily defer to the mere name of any fellow man. They are neither inclined to rest upon any man's authority, but, on the contrary, they are unremitting in their own efforts to find out the weaker points of their neighbor's doctrine. The people wish to decide not only on how to vote, but about what's true and what's not." Interesting considering today's world.